I was standing beside Roland at the front of the room when he slipped the ring onto my finger, and I was aware, in the way you are aware of things that are difficult to look at directly, of my cousin Celeste in the front row. She was not crying. She was not standing up. She was not doing any of the things that the people around her clearly expected and had privately prepared for. She was sitting completely still in a pale dress, her hands in her lap, watching the moment with an expression that I could not name. I had known Celeste my entire life. I knew her laugh and her temper and the specific way her face moved when she was hurt. I could read her the way you read someone you grew up beside. What I could not read was this. Everyone in that room had been braced for something. A word, a gesture, a sound, anything that would give the tension in the air somewhere to go. What we got instead was stillness. And when I looked at her directly, during the moment when Roland was saying the words that were making all of this real and permanent, Celeste looked back at me. She gave me a small smile. Not warm, not bitter. Just a smile. A small, contained, perfectly controlled smile. That evening Roland told me to stop thinking about her. He said it gently, with the slightly tired patience of someone who has had this conversation before and is prepared to have it again as many times as necessary. He said Celeste had always been dramatic, that she processed things in her own time, and that her silence was probably her version of a scene, a performance of dignity rather than genuine composure. He said I should not read too much into it. I listened to him, and I told him he was probably right. But I lay awake that night thinking about the smile. Not the silence itself, though the silence was strange enough. It was the smile. Dramatic people do not smile like that. People who are performing dignity do not smile like that. That smile was not the smile of someone managing their feelings in front of a room. It was the smile of someone who already knew something the room did not. In the weeks that followed, she did not call. She did not send a message. She did not appear at family gatherings that she would ordinarily have attended. She did not make any visible effort to process the situation in any direction at all. The people around us kept waiting for the explosion. It did not come. Roland's account of his marriage to Celeste was consistent and detailed. He said she had been cold in the final years, emotionally unavailable, withdrawn, difficult to reach. He said he had tried everything. He said the marriage had been effectively over long before I entered the picture, and that what had happened between us had not ended anything that was still alive. He described her as someone who struggled with closeness, who built walls, who was fundamentally unable to give the warmth that a real partnership required. I had listened to this account during the months before the wedding, and I had believed it because it was the only account available and because I wanted to believe it. But I kept returning to the Celeste I knew from before. The Celeste who showed up at my mother's hospital bedside and stayed for 3 days without being asked. The Celeste who remembered the specific things people told her in passing and checked in on them months later. The Celeste who could hold an entire room together when things got difficult, who was the person everyone reached for in a crisis. That Celeste was not cold. That Celeste was not difficult to reach. I kept those two versions of her side by side in my mind, and I could not reconcile them. My family did not handle the marriage the way I had hoped. I had known there would be difficulty. That was always going to be true. What I had not fully prepared for was the speed and completeness of it. My mother stopped taking my calls the week after the wedding. My aunt told me through a cousin that I was no longer welcome at the family home until I understood what I had done. My closest friend from childhood sent me a message that was 3 lines long and final in the way of messages that had been rewritten several times to remove the anger before sending. I had known Celeste was loved. I had not understood the full weight of that until the people who loved me most looked at what I had done and decided that their love for her was stronger than their need to protect me. Roland's family was different. They welcomed me with a warmth that should have been comforting and instead felt slightly too smooth. His mother in particular said very little about Celeste directly. But on one occasion, during an early dinner at her house, when I mentioned that the transition had been harder than I expected, she looked at me with an expression that was careful and knowing at once. "You'll understand soon," she said. She did not elaborate. She moved the conversation elsewhere and did not return to it. Moving into the house was something I had not thought through carefully enough. I understood, in abstract terms, that Roland had shared this space with someone else. What I had not understood was the specific texture of what that meant, that the house was not empty in any meaningful sense, only emptied. Celeste's books were on the shelves in the second bedroom, organized by subject in the particular way that she organized things. Her winter coats were in the hallway cupboard. Her handwriting was in the margins of the cookbook in the kitchen, small, precise notes about what worked and what did not, the kind of notes that accumulate over years of cooking in a place you intend to stay. Roland had not removed any of it. I asked him about this early on, carefully, in the way you ask about things that feel like they might have a difficult answer. He said he had been waiting for her to collect it, that he did not feel it was his place to move her belongings without her knowledge. This was reasonable. I agreed that it was reasonable. But living in those rooms, surrounded by the evidence of how thoroughly she had been present in that space, I felt something I had not expected. Not jealousy, exactly. Something more unsettling. The feeling was not that she had left. Her message arrived on a Tuesday morning, almost 3 weeks after the wedding. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and my phone, and the ordinary quiet of an early weekday, and her name appeared on the screen for the first time since everything had changed between us. I looked at it for a moment before I opened it. The message was short. Take care of what you chose. That was all. No punctuation beyond the full stop. No greeting, no name, no indication of emotion in either direction. I read it several times. I turned it over the way you turn something over when you know it is important but cannot immediately find the angle that makes it legible. The most obvious reading was the simplest one, a parting statement, a resigned acknowledgement of a situation she had accepted, an exit. Take care of what you chose.
I have made my peace with this. Goodbye.
But that reading kept sitting slightly wrong, because Celeste had never spoken in simple readings. She was precise with language in a way that most people were not. She said what she meant, and she meant exactly what she said, and she never wasted words. Take care of what you chose. The more I looked at it, the more it felt not like permission but like instruction. Not like an ending but like the first thing she needed me to know. The first signs were small. They always are, I think. Small enough to explain away individually, small enough that naming them feels like an overreaction, small enough that you can arrange them into a story about adjustment and newness and the ordinary friction of building a shared life with someone. Roland had opinions about what I wore. Not every day, not forcefully, but consistently, in a way that accumulated. A comment about a dress being too casual for a dinner. A suggestion about the color of something I had put on before we left the house. A question about whether I was sure that was what I wanted to wear. Each one was mild. Together, they added up to something that did not feel mild at all. He had opinions about who I spent time with as well. He called it concern. He said some of my friends were not people he trusted to look out for me, that their influence was not always positive, that he wanted to make sure I was surrounded by people who were genuinely good for me. He said all of this with the voice of someone who cared deeply and was simply trying to protect what they had. I recognized the language of care. I had always responded well to the language of care. Within 2 months of the wedding, I had become a different version of myself in public. Not dramatically. The change was not the kind that people commented on directly. But I could feel it in the way I moved through rooms, in the decisions I made about what to say and what to leave unsaid, in the small self-monitoring that had become a constant background presence. I had started checking his reaction before I spoke at gatherings. I had started choosing clothes in the morning with his comments in mind. I had started declining invitations with reasons that were technically true but were really just versions of I am not sure he would like that. People who had known me before noticed something, I think. A few of them said things, not directly but in the particular way of people who are trying to ask a question without asking it. One colleague said I seemed quieter lately. An old friend said I should come out more often, in a tone that carried more weight than the sentence itself. I smiled and said I was fine. I was not lying exactly. I had not yet fully identified what was happening as something that required a different kind of response. The financial situation became clear to me gradually, then all at once, the way some things do. I had come into the marriage with savings, not a large amount, but real, accumulated over several years of careful living. We had agreed in the early period that we would combine what we had and build from there. I had believed this was a partnership. What I discovered approximately 5 months in was that the combination had been one-directional. The joint account held both our incomes, but the property, the investments, the shared car, these were in his name. All of them. I raised it one evening. I tried to raise it carefully, framing it as a practical question about security rather than an accusation. He said I was overthinking it. He said this was how he organized things, that it was simpler this way, that it was not a reflection of anything except administrative preference. He said I was welcome to look at anything I wanted to look at, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. He was calm about it in the way he was calm about most things that I raised, the specific calm of someone who has had similar conversations before and has learned that the most effective response is patience. Later that week I found, while looking for a document in the study, a folder of photographs. The folder was at the back of the filing drawer, behind a row of insurance documents and bank statements. I nearly put it back, without looking inside. What stopped me was a small yellow sticky note on the front of it with Celeste's handwriting, that same precise, careful script I had seen in the cookbook margins. The note said only, for whoever needs it. I opened the folder. The contents were not photographs. They were documents, legal drafts, printouts, handwritten notes, a timeline that covered nearly 4 years and was annotated with dates and descriptions. I stood at the filing drawer and read. Not everything, not in that moment, there was too much, but enough to understand the shape of what I was holding. These were not the random papers of a disorganized life. They were preparation. Every document had been collected with intention. The notes in the margins were precise. Dates when money moved, dates when she had been prevented from seeing specific people, records of conversations she had written down within hours of having them. Celeste had been building something in this house, quietly and over a long period of time, while living inside the same situation I was now beginning to recognize from the outside. She had not run. She had documented. I closed the folder carefully and put it back exactly where I had found it. I read the notes in full over the following week, in small pieces, while Roland was out. What they described was a marriage that looked nothing like the one he had narrated to me. The isolation had been gradual. Friends dropped away one by one over the course of 3 years, each departure explained away by some version of they were not good for us, or you were never that close. The financial control had been incremental, each step framed as practicality, each stage of consolidation described as simplification. The monitoring of her movements, her communications, her relationships had been consistent and had escalated slowly enough that by the time the accumulation was visible, she was already deep inside it. She had written about the experience with a restraint that made it more rather than less affecting to read. She was not writing to be believed. She was writing to document, and the documentation was thorough in a way of someone who had understood early that her account of things would be disputed and had decided in advance to make the record undeniable. One line near the end of the notes stood out from the rest. It was underlined, unlike the others, and it said, "He needs someone to replace me. He will find her quickly." That line changed how I understood everything that had come before it, because I had not been an accident in this story. The realization arrived not as a single moment, but as a series of pieces clicking into place over several days. I had told myself the story of how Roland and I had come together as something that had happened, feelings that developed, a connection that formed, a situation that neither of us had entirely chosen but had both eventually acknowledged. I had been careful, in the telling of it, to preserve my own agency. I had chosen him. I had decided. But sitting with Celeste's notes and looking back over the sequence of events from the beginning, I started to see the shape of something different. The specific timing of when Roland had first paid me genuine attention. The conversations we had had in which he had made comparisons between himself and the men in my life and had consistently come out better in those comparisons. The way he had been present at moments when I was vulnerable, a difficult period at work, a falling out with a close friend, and the way his presence at those moments had felt like luck rather than design. I had been close. I was trusting. I had a relationship with Celeste that made me accessible in a way that someone further from his life would not have been. I had not been chosen because of who I was in any positive sense. I had been chosen because of where I was. I went back to her message. Take care of what you chose. I read it again with everything I now knew behind it, and it rearranged itself completely. She had known I would find the folder. The note on it for whoever needs it was not an accident. She had not left those documents for herself. She had left them for the next person. She had prepared evidence, organized and annotated, and left in a place a new occupant of the house would eventually find, because she had known there would be a next person. Because he had told her, or because she had observed it in him, or because she understood the pattern well enough to know how it would continue. The message she had sent me was not forgiveness, and it was not a curse, and it was not the exit statement of a woman washing her hands of a situation. It was a signpost. It said, "You are now inside the thing I was inside. What happens next is your choice." She had not warned me before the wedding because she knew I would not have believed her. She had not made a scene because scenes could be dismissed, denied, reframed as the behavior of a difficult woman who could not let go. She had let the situation speak.
She had let him show me.
I tested it deliberately on a Wednesday evening. Not dramatically, I was careful about that. What I did was simple. I declined to do something he asked. Not with anger, not with an accusation, not with any of the language that he would have had a framework for responding to. I said, calmly and clearly, that I had made other plans for that evening, and that I would be out. He went still in the way he sometimes went still, which was different from ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of something recalibrating. He asked what plans. I said I was meeting a friend. He asked which friend. I said a name from a category of people he had been gradually and patiently directing me away from. I said it pleasantly, and with no particular emphasis. What happened then was not what he would have wanted me to see. The warmth that was usually the first layer of any conversation we had dropped. Not completely, not permanently, he was too practiced for that. But it dropped enough. What was underneath, it was cold and sharp and very controlled, and it looked at me from behind his eyes for about 3 seconds before it went back under. He said of course that was fine. He said he hoped I had a good time. After that Wednesday the pace of things changed. He did not announce the change or explain it. It was not the kind of thing that gets announced. What happened was an accumulation of small new pressures that began to arrive close together. Messages asking where I was if I was later than usual. Comments about my family having turned me against him, delivered with sadness rather than accusation, which made them harder to address. An evening when I mentioned I had spoken to my mother, the first call she had answered in weeks, and found later that he had sent her a message that had ended the conversation and made her feel she should not call again. Each of these things was presented as something else. The messages were care. The comments were pain. The interference with my mother was protection, he said. He had not wanted me to be hurt by her continued judgment. He was very good at taking actions that controlled and reframing them as actions that protected. I had a growing collection of things I did not know how to argue with because he had already named them as love before I could name them as something else. I was also, increasingly, aware that I was in an earlier version of what the folder had described. That I was not yet where Celeste had been when she made her last entry. I sent her a message on a Thursday morning. It was brief and I wrote it and deleted it 3 times before I sent the version that felt accurate. It said, I found the folder. I think I understand what you were telling me. I need to talk. I pressed send and put the phone face down and did not pick it up again for 40 minutes. When I turned it over, she had already replied. She said, "Where can we meet?" The speed of her response undid something in me that had been tightly held. I had prepared for the possibility that she might not reply. I had prepared for the possibility that whatever had been between us was too damaged to reach across. I had not fully prepared for the possibility that she had been waiting, that she had sent that message and left that folder and had been patient enough and still enough to wait through all the months of silence for me to arrive at the place where I could send what I had just sent. We arranged to meet at a cafe in a part of the city that Roland rarely went to. I told him I had an errand to run. He asked what kind of errand. I said a work thing. He said of course. We met on a Saturday morning. I arrived first. We sat across from each other for a moment before either of us spoke. There was a lot between us. The wedding, the years before the wedding, the version of our relationship that had existed before Roland changed the shape of everything. I did not know how to navigate the weight of all of that in the amount of time we had available, and I think she understood this because she did not ask me to. She simply looked at me and waited. I told her I had read the notes. I told her I had seen the timeline. I told her I was experiencing things that matched what she had described, though I was earlier in the process than she had been. I used careful language and she listened carefully, and when I finished she said, "I know." She said it without satisfaction, without the energy of someone who had been proven right and wanted acknowledgement for it. She said it the way you say something you have known for a long time and are simply confirming out loud. I asked her why she had not warned me. She said she had tried, in the beginning, and that what she had said had been heard as jealousy and bitterness by everyone who heard it, including, she thought, me. I thought about the early months after I had begun seeing Roland, and I had to admit she was right. She explained it to me in the measured, sequential way of someone who has rehearsed it enough times in their own mind that the sequence feels natural. She had understood earlier than the timeline in the folder suggested, that leaving would not be enough. That if she simply left, the narrative would be his to write, and he would write it the way he had written it to me. She was cold, difficult, unable to give what the marriage required. She would become the reason. And whatever person came after her, would enter the situation already believing the version he had prepared. She had decided that the only way to protect the next person, and the only way to protect herself from the version of her that he would construct, was to document everything and leave it in a place that could be found. She had not told anyone she was doing this. Not her family, not her friends, not anyone who might inadvertently reveal it. She had stayed in the marriage longer than she would otherwise have stayed because she needed more time to complete the record. She had left it behind deliberately, in a folder in a place she calculated a new occupant of the house would eventually search. She had sent me the message that Tuesday morning, because by then she already knew I was in the house. We began meeting once a week, always in a different location, always with a cover story I had prepared and rehearsed. Celeste brought order to what I had been gathering loosely since the Wednesday test. She had a system. She had always had a system, and she applied it to what I was describing with the efficiency of someone who had already done this work once and understood the categories that mattered. We recorded dates. We recorded specific statements he had made, with context. We documented the financial situation as it stood. We noted the interference with my family and the pattern of increasing isolation. I was a faster collector than she had been because I already understood what I was looking for. Within 6 weeks, I had built a record that, alongside hers, created something substantial. The two accounts together covered a span of nearly 7 years. They described the same methods, the same language, the same escalation pattern across two different people. One account could be dismissed as the grievance of a difficult woman. Two accounts, documented separately and consistently, told a different kind of story entirely. Celeste had also, she mentioned one evening almost as an aside, never fully closed the legal proceedings from her side of the separation. She had paused them, deliberately, citing procedural reasons. She had waited for the right moment to complete them. She told me about the divorce papers on a rainy Tuesday in October. She said them quietly, with the precision she used for all important information, in the way of someone delivering a piece of news they have been carrying for a while and are finally ready to set down. The proceedings had never been formally concluded. There was a legal reason she had offered at the time, a procedural request for additional documentation that had effectively suspended the timeline. The suspension had been granted and then extended. Roland had not pressed it, which had surprised her initially and then had not surprised her at all, once she understood that an unresolved situation suited him in certain ways. He had the narrative of the abandoned marriage. He had the sympathy that came with it. He had the freedom of the new relationship without the financial and legal consequences of a concluded dissolution. She had let him believe the suspension was inertia on her part. It was not inertia. It was calculation. She had kept the proceedings open because an open case gave her certain rights of access to financial information that a concluded case would not. She had used that access carefully and over a long period, building a financial record that told a complete and detailed story. The argument that gave me what I needed happened on a Thursday evening in November. I had been careful not to push directly for it. I had been patient, which had become easier as the weeks passed, and I had more to anchor the patience to. What I had done was stop managing his reactions as carefully as I had been managing them. Not stop entirely. I did not want to alarm him, and I did not want to give him cause to act before I was ready. But I allowed the small frictions that I had previously smoothed over to remain unsmoothed. I was less immediately available. I was slightly less compliant. I let my responses to his comments about my friends carry a small amount of the disagreement that they actually contained. He had been reading my compliance as a baseline, and the slight deviation from it registered. On that Thursday, he said something about my mother, an implication about her motives that was designed to make me doubt her again, the same method he had used successfully before. But this time I did not nod and redirect. I said clearly that I disagreed. The cold thing that I had seen for 3 seconds on the Wednesday I tested him came back. This time it stayed longer. He raised his voice. The family gathering was my aunt's birthday, a regular annual event that had predated all of this by decades and that Roland had attended as Celeste's husband and then, with a smooth and unremarked transition, as mine. I arrived with Roland. Celeste arrived separately, 20 minutes later. She had told no one she was coming. Her presence produced the specific quality of silence that happens when a room that has been managing a subject without naming it suddenly has to stop managing it. Roland's expression when he saw her was the most revealing thing about him I had ever observed. Not anger, not surprise, not guilt exactly. Something more calculated. He was reading the situation, assessing what it meant and what it required.
He was very fast at this.
But he was not fast enough. Because at the moment when he was still assessing, Celeste looked at me and I looked back at her, and she gave me a small nod. I stood up. I said I needed everyone's attention for a few minutes. Roland said my name in the specific tone he used when he wanted to redirect without appearing to redirect. I said I would not take long. I connected my phone to the television, and I opened the folder I had prepared. The first document on the screen was the financial timeline. The second was the personal record. The third was the recording from November. The recording was less than 4 minutes long, but it was clear. His voice filled the room. Calm at first, then colder, then the version of him that had only ever been visible to the women who lived with him. The room listened. I watched faces change. His mother, who had sat very still through the documents, made a small sound when the recording reached the part where he described what he expected from the people in his life. She had heard it before, I thought. She had heard something like it before and had told herself it was not what it was. Roland tried to speak twice during the recording. His uncle touched his arm, and he stopped. When the recording ended, there was a silence that had a different quality from the silence at my wedding, not watchful, not waiting. This silence was the silence of people who had reached an understanding they had not had before and were sitting inside it. His sister asked, with a directness that surprised me, how long it had been going on. Celeste answered. She described the timeline with the same precision with which she had documented it. She did not use dramatic language. She did not make accusations beyond what the record showed. She simply described, accurately and in sequence, what her marriage had been. Then I described, accurately and in sequence, what mine had been. I left the house that Saturday. I had been preparing for it, quietly for 3 weeks, moving small things to a storage unit I had rented, organizing the documents that were mine, making sure the accounts I needed access to were accessible. I did not leave in a dramatic moment. I did not leave in the middle of a confrontation or on the back of something he had done. I left on a morning when he was out, in a way that was calm and completely final, with 2 bags and a folder and the clear knowledge of exactly what I was and was not taking. What I was not taking was the version of myself I had been inhabiting for the past year, the self-monitoring, the calculation of his reactions, the management of my own life according to what would or would not produce friction with him. I left that behind completely in the house and did not look back at it. Celeste was parked around the corner. She had offered and I had accepted because I had not yet rebuilt the network that had been worn away and because there was something right about it being her. She did not say much when I got in the car. She drove and I watched the streets, and neither of us needed to fill the quiet with anything. 8 months later, I understand things I could not have understood before. The year I spent inside that house gave me a knowledge of something I would not otherwise have had, not the specific knowledge of his methods, which I hope never to need again, but a broader understanding of how a situation can be made to look like one thing while being another, and how the people inside it are often the last to see the full shape of what surrounds them. Celeste and I have been building something back between us, carefully and without rushing, because what was between us before was real even though it was complicated, and real things do not simply disappear under the weight of what happens to them. We meet for coffee on Sunday mornings when the weather allows it in a cafe near the park, and we talk about our lives. Her legal proceedings concluded 3 months ago. She is living in a flat she chose for herself and decorating it in the exact way she wants. She seems like a person who has returned to herself after a long time away.
I think I understand something about that.
I thought, when I married Roland, that I was the one who had taken something from her,